You were never just a dream, and I can finally prove it. People often tell you to be realistic, to lower your expectations, to fit inside the lines that were drawn long before you got here. They'll say your ideas are too big, too risky, too unlikely. But here's the thing. Every meaningful breakthrough in human history started as something that sounded unrealistic. At some point, flight was impossible. Electric cars were impractical. Reusable rockets were a joke. And yet, here we are. So when they told you that your vision was just a dream, what they really meant was they couldn't see it yet. Because a dream isn't just something you imagine when you're asleep. It's a preview of a future that doesn't exist yet. The difference between something being a dream and something being real is execution. Relentless, obsessive, sometimes irrational execution. It's waking up every day knowing the odds are against you and doing it anyway. It's being willing to fail publicly, repeatedly, and still keep going. It's betting on something when there's no guarantee, no applause, and no safety net. That's where proof comes from. Not from words, not from opinions, but from building, brick by brick, line of code by line of code, prototype by prototype. And eventually, something strange happens. People tend to reject what they don't immediately understand. When an idea falls outside their experience, it creates discomfort. And the easiest way to deal with that discomfort is to label the idea as unrealistic or impossible. This isn't necessarily because the idea lacks value, but because it challenges existing assumptions about what can and cannot be done. Human thinking is often shaped by patterns, what has worked before, what has been seen before, and what feels familiar. Anything that breaks those patterns is automatically met with skepticism. It's a kind of mental shortcut, a way of protecting oneself from uncertainty. Throughout history, this reaction has been consistent. Innovations that later became essential parts of everyday life were once dismissed as impractical or even absurd. The issue isn't the idea itself, it's timing and perception. When something is introduced too early, before the environment is ready for it, or before people have the context to understand it, it appears unrealistic. But that doesn't mean it is. It simply means the gap between the present and the future is too wide for most people to see clearly. There's also a social element to this resistance. People are influenced by the opinions of those around them. If the majority believes something won't work, that belief spreads quickly, reinforcing itself. Doubt becomes the default position, not because everyone has carefully analyzed the idea, but because it feels safer to agree with the crowd. Supporting something unconventional carries risk of being wrong, of being judged, or of standing alone. So most choose skepticism over curiosity. Another factor is the fear of failure. When people hear about bold ideas, they often imagine the worst-case scenario. They focus on what could go wrong rather than what could go right. This mindset limits the ability to recognize potential. Instead of asking, "What if this works?" the question becomes, "What if it fails?" That shift in perspective can shut down possibilities before they even have a chance to be explored. At the same time, people tend to underestimate how much progress is possible over time. They judge new ideas based on current limitations rather than future advancements. Technology, resources, and knowledge are constantly evolving, but skepticism often ignores that. What seems impossible today may become achievable tomorrow with the right effort and innovation. Dismissing an idea too early overlooks the dynamic nature of progress. There's also a tendency to confuse unfamiliarity with impossibility. Just because something hasn't been done before doesn't mean it can't be done. In fact, every breakthrough begins as something that hasn't been done. The absence of precedent is often mistaken as evidence against feasibility when it's actually the starting point of innovation. If every idea had to fit within existing boundaries, nothing new would ever emerge. For those who bring forward unconventional ideas, this environment can be challenging. Constant doubt from others can create pressure to conform or abandon the idea altogether. But skepticism from others doesn't determine the value or potential of the idea. It only reflects the current limits of their perspective. The ability to continue despite that doubt is what separates ideas that remain unrealistic from those that eventually become reality. Over time, as progress is made and results begin to appear, perception starts to shift. What was once dismissed begins to gain attention. People start to reconsider their assumptions. The same idea that faced resistance begins to feel more acceptable, even obvious. This shift doesn't happen because the idea changed, but because understanding caught up with it. In many cases, the label of unrealistic is temporary. It's not a final judgment, it's a reflection of the moment in which the idea is introduced. As conditions change and progress continues, that label can disappear entirely. What remains is the realization that the idea was never impossible, just ahead of its time. A dream is often misunderstood as something distant from reality, something fragile or imaginary, but in many cases, it's closer to a blueprint than a fantasy. It begins as a clear image in the mind, an outcome, a possibility, a version of the future that doesn't yet exist in the physical world. That image might feel intangible, but it carries structure, it has direction, intention, and often a surprising level of detail. What makes it seem unreal is not its lack of validity, but the fact that it hasn't been translated into action yet. When people dismiss dreams, they usually focus on the gap between the present and the envisioned future. That gap can feel overwhelming. It's filled with unknowns, risks, and effort that hasn't yet been invested. But the existence of that gap doesn't invalidate the dream. It simply defines the work required to bring it to life. In that sense, a dream is not separate from reality. It's an early stage of it. It's the starting point before plans, processes, and execution take shape. Every creation begins twice, first in the mind, then in the real world. The mental version comes first because it allows exploration without limitations. It's where ideas can evolve freely, where possibilities are tested without cost. This stage is essential because it provides clarity. Without a dream, without that initial vision, there's no direction for action. Effort becomes scattered, reactive, and unfocused. A dream, even if it's not fully defined, acts as a guiding force that aligns decisions and priorities. There's also a reason why dreams often feel ambitious or even unrealistic. When the mind isn't constrained by current limitations, it naturally reaches for better, faster, more efficient, or more impactful outcomes. It imagines improvements that don't yet exist. That's not a flaw, it's a feature. It allows progress to happen. If dreams were always limited to what is currently possible, they wouldn't push boundaries or lead to innovation. They would simply reinforce the status quo. However, a dream on its own isn't enough. Its value lies in its potential to be developed. It needs to evolve from a broad idea into something more concrete. That transformation happens through questioning, refining, and breaking the vision into smaller, manageable parts. The clearer the dream becomes, the easier it is to identify the steps needed to move toward it. What once felt abstract starts to take on form. At the same time, it's important to recognize that not every detail needs to be known from the beginning. A dream doesn't have to come with a complete roadmap. In fact, most don't. The process of building it often reveals new information, new challenges, and new opportunities that couldn't have been predicted at the start. This is why flexibility matters. The core vision can remain intact while the path toward it adapts over time. Another aspect that makes dreams powerful is their ability to create motivation. When a vision feels meaningful, it generates energy. It provides a reason to act, even when the outcome is uncertain. That internal drive is often stronger than external pressure because it's tied to something personal. It turns effort into something purposeful rather than forced. It's also worth noting that many things we now consider normal once existed only as ideas in someone's mind. Before they were designed, built, or implemented, they were dreams. Concepts without physical proof. The transition from idea to reality didn't happen instantly. It required persistence, iteration, and time, but the initial dream was the seed that made everything else possible. In this way, a dream is not an escape from reality, it's an early version of it. It represents what could be, before the work has been done to make it visible. The difference between something that remains a dream and something that becomes real is not in the idea itself, but in whether it is developed, tested, and built upon. Ideas by themselves don't change anything. They can be exciting, inspiring, even brilliant, but without action, they remain static. What turns an idea into something real is execution, and not just occasional effort, but sustained, focused, and often uncomfortable work over time. This is where most concepts either begin to take shape or quietly fade away. The gap between imagining something and building it is filled with discipline, consistency, and a willingness to engage with the details. Execution starts with moving beyond abstraction. A broad vision has to be broken down into specific steps that can actually be carried out. This often means starting small, even when the end goal is massive. The first version is rarely impressive. It's usually incomplete, rough, and limited in capability, but it serves a purpose. It transforms the idea from something theoretical into something tangible. Once that first step is taken, progress becomes measurable. There's something to test, improve, and build upon. Consistency plays a critical role here. One burst of effort isn't enough to create meaningful results. Execution requires showing up repeatedly, even when motivation fluctuates. Some days the work feels exciting, and other days it feels routine or even frustrating. But progress doesn't depend on how you feel in a given moment. It depends on whether you continue. Over time, these repeated efforts compound. Small improvements add up, gradually closing the gap between where things started and where they need to go. Another important part of execution is dealing with uncertainty. At the beginning, there are always unknowns, things that can't be fully predicted or planned for. Waiting for complete clarity often leads to inaction. Instead, execution involves making decisions with limited information, testing those decisions, and adjusting based on the results. It's an iterative process. You try something, observe what happens, learn from it, and refine your approach. This cycle repeats many times, each iteration bringing the idea closer to a workable form. Mistakes are unavoidable in this process. In fact, they're a natural byproduct of doing something that hasn't been done before. Execution isn't about avoiding errors, it's about responding to them effectively. When something doesn't work, it provides data, it reveals what needs to change. The key is to treat setbacks as feedback rather than failure. That perspective allows progress to continue instead of stopping at the first obstacle. There's also a level of focus required that often goes unnoticed. Execution demands prioritization. Not every task contributes equally to the outcome, and not every opportunity is worth pursuing. Deciding what to work on and what to ignore is part of the process. Without that focus, effort gets diluted and progress slows down. Clear priorities help maintain direction, especially when there are distractions or competing demands. Time is another factor that shapes execution. Meaningful results rarely happen quickly. There's a tendency to expect rapid progress, but most complex ideas require sustained effort over extended periods. This can be challenging because the early stages often show little visible progress. It may feel like nothing is happening, even though foundational work is being done. Staying committed during this phase is critical, because this is where many ideas lose momentum. Execution also requires a certain level of resilience. There will be moments when progress stalls, when results don't match expectations, or when external doubt becomes louder. Continuing in those moments isn't easy, but it's necessary. The ability to persist, despite setbacks, often determines whether something eventually succeeds or not. Over time, consistent execution transforms the nature of the idea itself. What started as something uncertain becomes more defined, more functional, and more real. Each step adds clarity and substance. Eventually, the difference between the original vision and the current reality becomes smaller and smaller, until the idea is no longer just something imagined, but something that exists and can be experienced. Failure is often treated as something to avoid, something that signals the end of an effort. But in practice, it plays a very different role. When working towards something new or ambitious, failure isn't an exception, it's part of the process. It shows up not because something is fundamentally wrong, but because the path forward isn't fully known yet. Each attempt reveals something that wasn't clear before, and that information becomes useful if it's handled correctly. At the beginning of any challenging effort, there's a gap between what is intended and what is actually possible with current knowledge or resources. That gap is where failure tends to occur. An approach is tried, and it doesn't work as expected. Instead of seeing that as a final outcome, it can be viewed as a form of feedback. It answers a question: does this method work? If the answer is no, then the next step is to understand why. That understanding reduces uncertainty and improves the next attempt. This process is inherently iterative. One attempt leads to another, each one slightly more informed than the last. Over time, the number of unknowns decreases. What initially seemed unpredictable becomes more manageable. This is why repeated setbacks, while frustrating, can actually move things forward. They narrow down possibilities, eliminate ineffective strategies, and highlight areas that need adjustment. There's also an important distinction between careless failure and deliberate failure. Careless failure comes from a lack of preparation or attention, where mistakes could have been avoided. Deliberate failure, on the other hand, comes from pushing boundaries, testing limits, trying approaches that may or may not work. The second type is where progress happens. It requires a willingness to step into uncertainty, knowing that not every attempt will succeed. One of the challenges with failure is how it's perceived, both internally and externally. Internally, it can trigger doubt. After multiple setbacks, it's easy to question whether the effort is worth continuing. Externally, there may be criticism or skepticism from others who only see the outcome, not the process behind it. Managing these perceptions is part of the journey. It involves maintaining focus on long-term progress rather than short-term results. Another factor is how quickly someone can recover from failure. The time between attempts matters. If too much time is spent analyzing or reacting emotionally, momentum can be lost. On the other hand, moving forward too quickly without learning anything from the experience can lead to repeated mistakes. The balance lies in extracting useful insights efficiently and applying them to the next step. Failure also builds a kind of resilience that can't be developed in any other way. Facing setbacks repeatedly changes how challenges are approached. Instead of being seen as threats, they become expected elements of the process. This shift reduces hesitation. It becomes easier to take calculated risks because the outcome, whether success or failure, both contribute to progress. Over time, patterns begin to emerge. What initially felt like random setbacks start to show structure. Certain approaches consistently perform better than others. Certain problems appear more frequently. Recognizing these patterns allows for more informed decisions. It turns what was once trial and error into something more strategic. It's also worth noting that many outcomes labeled as failure are not complete losses. Even when a specific attempt doesn't achieve its goal, parts of it may still be useful. Skills are developed, systems are improved, and knowledge is gained. These elements carry forward into future efforts, increasing the likelihood of success over time. As the process continues, the nature of failure begins to change. Early failures might be broad and fundamental, while later ones become more refined and specific. This progression indicates movement in the right direction. Each setback becomes smaller, more targeted, and easier to address. Eventually, what once seemed like repeated failure reveals itself as a necessary path toward a working solution. The final outcome often depends not on avoiding mistakes, but on continuing long enough to learn from them. The future is not something that simply arrives on its own, fully formed and independent of human effort. It is shaped, piece by piece, by the decisions people make and the actions they take. While many choose to follow established paths, there are those who take a different approach. Instead of waiting for change, they create it. These are the individuals who build, who take ideas and turn them into something functional, something tangible, something that didn't exist before. Building requires a shift in mindset. It's not about accepting the world as it is, but questioning how it could be improved. This often starts with noticing inefficiencies, gaps, or limitations in current systems. Where others might see inconvenience and move on, builders see opportunity. They ask, why does it work this way? And more importantly, can it work better? That curiosity becomes the starting point for innovation. However, recognizing a problem is only the beginning. What defines builders is their willingness to engage with complexity. Creating something new is rarely straightforward. It involves navigating technical challenges, resource constraints, and unpredictable outcomes. There isn't always a clear roadmap, which means decisions must be made without complete certainty. This can be uncomfortable, but it's also where progress happens. Risk is an unavoidable part of this process. Choosing to build something new often means stepping away from stability. There's no guarantee that the effort will succeed, and there are usually easier, safer alternatives available. Despite this, builders move forward because the potential impact outweighs the uncertainty. They are willing to invest time, energy, and resources into something that may not pay off immediately, or at all. Another defining characteristic is ownership. Builders take responsibility for outcomes, both good and bad. When something works, it's the result of their effort. When something fails, they don't shift blame. They analyze what went wrong and adjust. This level of accountability creates a feedback loop that accelerates improvement. It ensures that progress is continuous rather than dependent on external factors. There's also a strong element of persistence involved. Building something meaningful takes time, often longer than initially expected. Early stages can feel slow, with little visible progress. There may be periods where effort doesn't seem to produce results, where challenges accumulate, and motivation fluctuates. Continuing through these phases requires discipline and a clear sense of purpose. As progress is made, even in small increments, momentum begins to build. Each improvement makes the next step slightly easier. Systems become more refined, processes more efficient, and outcomes more predictable. What once required significant effort starts to become manageable. Over time, this accumulation of progress leads to something substantial. Builders also tend to think in terms of long-term impact rather than immediate validation. Many of the most significant changes are not instantly recognized. They take time to be understood, adopted, and integrated into everyday life. This means that external recognition or approval may come much later, if at all. The focus remains on the work itself and the value it creates. Collaboration can play a role as well. While the initial vision may come from an individual, building at scale often involves others. Bringing together different skills, perspectives, and expertise can accelerate progress and improve outcomes. It transforms a single idea into a collective effort, increasing its reach and effectiveness. Over time, the results of building become visible. What started as an idea evolves into something that influences how people live, work, or interact. These changes may seem gradual, but they accumulate, shaping the direction of entire industries or even society as a whole. In the end, the distinction lies in action. Many people imagine possibilities, but only a few take the steps required to realize them. The future is ultimately shaped by those who choose to move from thought to creation, from concept to execution, and from possibility to reality.